Hello, hello. Can everyone hear me okay? Wonderful. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Chelsea Gonzalez. I'm the Strategic Solutions Manager here at Worldwide Express, and I'm accompanied by Adrian Miller. And the goal today is just to kind of walk you guys through the advantages of working with a company like Worldwide and a 3PL. So he's going to kind of give you the breakdown, walk you through, show you what the benefits are. And then afterwards, we're going to go ahead and ask if you guys have any questions and kind of take it from there. So, Adrian?
Cool. Well, appreciate the introduction, everybody. I think what I'm just going to say, if you hear me stutter over my words, when I'm talking into the microphone right now, it's like repeating back into my ears. So it's kind of like when you talk on speakerphone and have the echo. So it'll take a little bit of an adjustment on my side. But I think to Chelsea's point, I think as much as we want this to be just kind of a shameless plug for Worldwide Express, I think the hope is to kind of give you guys insights into the different ways we see organizations interact with our business, right? And evaluate the decision about whether or not a 3PL is the right fit for their organization, or if there's a more effective way for them to go to market. So I'll kind of jump in, give you guys a little bit of a background on, the WWEX Group, where and why we operate in the marketplace, and then kind of go into, the different ways we see customers evaluate a potential partnership, whether it is the WWEX Group or any of the other organizations in the space. And then just kind of the different ways we'll interact with our customers, depending on where they are in their growth cycle. So, depending on size and scope, what the different solutions might look like. So again, the hope is for this to be interactive as much as I do love the sound of my own voice, like any other salesperson. If you guys got questions, right, give us a shout as we kind of go along. So a little bit of background about Worldwide Express. So we were founded in 1992. We actually started out as a reseller of DHL's Airborne Express, right? And we're a franchise-based model. Fast forward to 2008, DHL decided that, hey, it doesn't make sense to have a domestic offering within the US anymore. So that's when we started our partnership with UPS. So we are currently the only entity outside of UPS that is able to issue a business their own 6-digit UPS account number. In 2008, that was also the same time we started our partnerships with our LTL carriers and started to build that line of business. And then, fast forward to today, we've gone through a couple different mergers and acquisitions. So we're about a $4.5 billion organization. Across our 3 different brands, we have Worldwide Express, right, which is our corporate kind of go-to-market strategy. We have our Global Trans brand, which is our agent model. And then we also have Unishippers, which is our franchise model. So across those, 3 brands within our organization, we do about $4.5 billion in revenue, and we have about 108,000 customers. So we feel like we're, maybe not unique, but we have somewhat of a special position within the marketplace to be able to see, a pretty broad spectrum of how we interact with different customers, how they go to market, and what the different solutions look like for each of those customers. So we'll see if I can get the clicker to work. So I think to start out, right, like typically when we're engaging with somebody, right, the question we'll typically get is, why do we need a 3PL, right? Like I could do this on my own, and I think the answer is probably yes, you absolutely could. But walking through what are the decisions and the different factors you have to weigh when you're evaluating whether or not, hey, we should outsource a portion of our logistics or transportation versus trying to build some of that infrastructure in-house. So when we look at, factors that are going to, functions that these organizations would have to perform internally, right? The first one is pricing negotiation. I mean, probably not as hard as it sounds, because if any of you ship any product at all, you probably get 15 calls a day from different freight brokers offering you access to different pricing and rates and stuff like that. So in addition to that, there's probably the technology system. So whether or not you're outsourcing that to a SaaS partner, whether or not you're building that in-house, or we even see you go into a warehouse and people have a map that's going to route different carriers based on that region. Once you've established some of that pricing, you need to have some sort of a way to optimize to make sure that the work you've done to build those relationships and negotiate those rates, that on every single order you're able to optimize the cost, right? So typically it's, whether it's a routing guide, whether it's a system you build in-house or something you procure, that's typically an evaluation organizations need to make. On top of that, it's the ability to kind of monitor performance and KPIs for carriers. So understanding, hey, we've negotiated these rates, we have routing guides. How effectively is it working, right? Is it accomplishing what we need to as an organization to effectively serve our customers? And a lot of that depends on your resources internally, right? Can you build and effectively track that data? And in-transit operations and support. So, one of the things we all know about transportation is eventually something's going to go wrong, right? So do you have the processes in place in order to assess those, in order to be able to identify those, and then escalate those effectively, whether it's parcel, whether it's LTL, whether it's truckload? Typically, we see that will fall in a couple different places, whether that's handled by the shipping team, whether it's handled by the CSR team. That's usually a factor that organizations want to have an understanding of is, hey, if something goes wrong, do we have a way to address it internally? Or is that something where we need a partner to help us with? And then the last piece is probably, invoice auditing. And there's two pieces to that, right? So if you're negotiating a parcel contract, if you're negotiating your own LTL contracts, if you're putting together an RFP for your truckload business, how do you make sure that the rates you've negotiated are effectively what you guys are getting invoiced for, right? So that process can be pretty manual if it's unfamiliar for an organization. So that's another thing that we see companies kind of weigh is like, hey, we've gone out, we've negotiated, we've executed. How do we verify that what we've negotiated is actually what we're realizing as an organization and impacting our P&L the way that we had hoped? And I think when we talk about different factors that influence whether that's the right decision for you guys, typically what we see, it's not a secret, right? Spend. So if you're talking about potentially being able to bring operations in-house and drive down your transportation spend by 10%, well, if you're spending $50,000 a year, maybe it doesn't quite make sense, right? Once you start getting into 10, 20, $15 million, the ROI for adding additional resources in order to start to build that infrastructure starts to make a lot more sense, right? So I don't think that's any secret, right? The more you spend, the more you could stand to save by starting to bring some of those operations in-house. The second one that I think we think is most important, right, is the complexity of shipping your product, right? I think like a pretty easy rule of thumb is if it's easier for carriers to move, it's going to be easier for you all to handle internally. So I think like a good analogy for us that we want to use is, if you're shipping standard pallets of envelopes, it's really heavy, it's really dense, it's hard to damage, it's going B2B, that's going to be a lot easier to go out, procure, competitive pricing, and be able to manage that versus if you're, shipping outdoor furniture that's going direct to residents, they're not super familiar with how LTL transportation works, you're going to run into a lot more issues around damage. The product is typically going to be more expensive. At that point, the cost to do and manage a lot of those functions internally is going to be significantly higher. So I think that's probably the second biggest thing is, just for lack of a better term, how nice is your freight? How nice is your product to ship? If it sucks for these carriers, odds are you're going to want some additional resources. If it's really easy, it's probably going to be a little bit easier for you guys to handle that internally. The third piece is like your technology budget and resources, right? And I think the best way to think about this is how easy is it for you to incorporate additional vendors, additional carriers, different solutions into your existing network. So if you're pretty nimble, right, and it's easier for you to add a different carrier, if it's easy for you to start to look at final mile solutions and aggregate multiple parcel providers. So if it's really easy for you to incorporate different partners into that, it's going to be a little bit easier for you to continue to evolve as your business scales. If it's really hard for you to incorporate new partners, if it's going to take a ton of legwork for the organization, if it's going to be, if you're going to have to outsource that to a different IT partner in order to incorporate some additional carriers and partners, well, then you probably want a 3PL who's already built out a lot of that network. So you're building one initial connection into whatever sort of infrastructure you have. And then as your business grows, you need different solutions, you need different carriers. That 3PL has already built that into the network for you. So a lot of it is how nimble is your infrastructure and how effectively can you add and kind of pivot within the existing environment you've built. All right, we're going to stay with this slide. So the other thing that we want to talk about, right, is, once organizations have made the decision, hey, it makes sense for us to work with a 3PL in some capacity, right? They feel like, hey, the ROI is pretty significant for our organization. We want to talk a little bit about like how those relationships look depending on where you are in the market, right? As you can imagine, our relationship with, a new business who's spending $20,000, $30,000 on parcel is going to look a little bit different than if we were to engage like an Amazon or a Best Buy, right? So across markets, kind of talking about a little bit of the different ways that our relationship kind of takes place and, what the value proposition is for those organizations. So we typically look at it in 3 buckets, right? And it's not a rule of thumb, right? You'll have SMB shippers who go to market as if they're enterprise companies, right? And mid-market companies operate as if they're SMB, right? So these are just kind of generally what we see in the market. We'll look at SMB, and typically we want to quantify that as annual transportation spend, right? So if we're looking at $40,000 to $500,000 a year in annual transportation spend, mid-market we're probably looking at $500,000 to $10 million in transportation, and then enterprise is typically $10 million and above, right? It's not a hard and fast rule, but generally those are kind of the buckets where we start to see the behavior change. So a little bit about how our relationships will work at the different parts in the market. So for instance, on the SMB side, it's largely transactional, right? And it's not to mean that it's purely a price play, although they're usually a little bit more sensitive to that, right? Because every order is going to have a higher incremental value, right? When you're able to shave off 10, 15% within those. But I think what we mean by that is we're not restructuring the way they go to market, right? It's typically, hey, we're currently sending out 5 LTL shipments. Our relationship with them is how do we make sure we help you do that more effectively? So optimizing to price on every single order, being able to make sure that we're tracking and monitoring different KPIs when it relates to service. We're not necessarily trying to change the way they go to market. We're trying to help them go to market in the same way, but just a little bit more effectively. So when, what that looks like, it's, like we said, access to market correct pricing, right? If you want to work with the 3PL, it helps to be able to leverage some more significant purchasing power. Customer support, and oftentimes it's education as well. Like the freight industry can be pretty dynamic and archaic at times. So if you're new to the space, your primary focus is not going to be, hey, how do I make sure I'm shipping everything as effectively as possible? It's probably, hey, how can I grow my business? And a lot of times you're wanting a resource to help you navigate different challenges as you grow. So if you're launching a new product line, if you're going into a new big box retailer, it can help to have a partner at least start to get your head around the right way to navigate some of those challenges. And from a technology standpoint, right, like just being able to leverage a 3PL's existing technology. So again, when you're talking about invoice auditing, KPI tracking, cost optimization on every order, that helps. And I think we see it benefited a couple different departments, right? So your shipping department, you're going to hopefully be able to save time. Your customer service, purchasing, you're going to have increased visibility. And then on the accounting side, right, hopefully you're able to allocate those costs appropriately. So that's typically from a high level what our relationship looks like in the SMB. As we move upstream to kind of mid-market, I would characterize this as more of a consultative relationship. And I think what we mean by that is like oftentimes these are organizations who have grown pretty substantially, right? And sometimes their go-to-market strategies that relates to their transportation, they've probably outgrown that, but their primary focus is just on driving that growth, right? So maybe it's something that hasn't gotten a ton of love. So what I mean by say when we're a little bit more consultative is they start to get, increases in volume. Their go-to-market strategy might be causing issues that they don't realize. So we start to ask, at this point in the process, a lot more about why they go to market the way they do. And it gives us the ability to introduce different solutions that are above and beyond just, hey, you ship out 10 LTL, we're going to help you ship those 10 LTL better, right? It's more about, hey, does it make sense for us to be consolidating those into a multi-stop truckload? Should we be injecting those into a final mile carriers network? If you do a ton of parcel from the East Coast to the West Coast, should we be looking at zone skipping? And how do you build some of those business rules to make sure your organization operates effectively? I think like one good example of this is, we have a customer who we started working with recently, and they drop ship a ton of product from their vendors, but their vendor doesn't have the warehouse space to stage 3, 4, 5 truckloads. So what happens is they'll have 2-3 hours lead time to pick up a truckload and get it to a job site where they have people waiting for it. It creates a couple of different issues, right? You're somewhat at the whim of the spot market when it comes to capacity to get a truck in there with a 3-hour window. You're probably going to be paying above market in some instances, more often than not. And it can cause operational issues, right? If you're missing pickups, you're missing deliveries. So instead of just saying, hey, we're going to come in here as a $2 billion brokerage and we're just going to buy these trucks at the last minute more effectively than you are today, we'll go and find them a warehousing space that's down the street from their vendor within, a couple of miles, and we'll have them advance stage, 20, 30 truckloads of product. And short term, there's probably some additional expense there, but what it's able to allow them to do is organically build lead time into their process, so they're not paying above market on every single transaction. They're not running into missed pickups, and they don't have issues where they have an entire crew on a job site waiting for product. So that's just a small example of kind of what that looks like when we can move a little bit further upstream within an organization. From a technology standpoint, we typically see that integrated solutions are going to pay higher dividends. So when you talk about saving 2-3 minutes per shipment, right? The ROI on that when you're going, sending out 100, 200 shipments a week can be a little bit more significant than if it's, 5-10 shipments a day. From operational support, typically this involves us moving, getting a little bit further ingrained in the organization, right? Versus being kind of a reactive resource when things go wrong. We're probably going to participate a little bit more holistically in that organization's process, right? So it can look, we can be as deep as, outsourcing the entire supply chain, or we can be operating under a set of business rules where we're going to decide how certain orders should be routed. So we'll have different parameters that we set, and our teams will be able to make decisions about, hey, these 4 orders should go in a multi-stop truckload. This shipment needs to go LTL, and then these 7 orders are going to go to a truckload. It can also just look as simple as, hey, we're going to do some stuff that's a little bit more proactive because they have high-touch customers, or their product can be a little bit difficult, right? So it requires some proactive intervention. So it's typically a little bit more than just, reactive support. And then from a reporting standpoint, right, we're going to have a little bit more that, these companies are going to need a more robust set of data and KPIs to review. And we're actually going to be able to use this to start to make some business decisions versus, if you're a little bit smaller of a shipper, a lot of times it's just understanding what's driving the data versus being able to use this to make decisions about, hey, where should I be locating my next warehouse, right? Where are we having issues, geographically with certain carriers, and then being able to go back to those and say, hey, are you late every time you go to California because you suck to California? Or is it, hey, are we messing up because we don't get you the product in time, so we're missing line haul? So a lot of times from like a data standpoint, we're getting a little bit more granular with some of that to kind of help the business function the way it needs to. And then on enterprise, right, I think the biggest difference, right, is the buying process is going to be more standardized with bigger organizations, and it's typically going to be cyclical, right? So if you're looking at a quarterly and annual RFP, I think that's the most common kind of go-to-market strategy we see. Typically at this point in kind of an organization's life cycle, the operational pain points have already been identified, and it's more about finding the right partner who's going to be able to most effectively solve those pain points and then do so at the most competitive rate, right? So it's less about us saying, hey, this is causing issues within your network. They've usually identified those issues, and it's about, hey, who has the most sophisticated and cost-effective solution. Our involvement there typically is on a more specific need versus like a wholesale outsourcing, right? As much as I'd love to say, hey, I can go work with Amazon tomorrow and give me all of your shipping, that probably doesn't really make sense, right? But there's probably pieces of their network where they're going to leverage a 3PL, right, to help with specific projects. And then I think the biggest thing too is, as a 3PL, you have to be able to integrate yourself into any sort of their existing technology infrastructure, right? You're not going to go and recommend a different TMS, a different operating system for them to work in order to accommodate your needs. At that point, the possible investment there is too significant. So I think that's the other piece. And then when it comes to, different performance standards and KPI attainment, those are typically contractually agreed upon, not only by the 3PL, but also by the shipper and the organization in this case. So, hey, if we're going to be held to certain on-time delivery, on-time pickup standards, there's also different requirements on what kind of lead time we're going to be provided in order for those metrics to be tracked. So that's pretty much all we got. We can open it up to Q&A. We're probably got a little bit of time. I know you guys are disappointed you didn't get to hear us talk at you for the full 45 minutes. So if any questions, concerns from anybody, we'd be happy to answer them. Talk a little bit about different ways we work with customers or provide different solutions or challenges that we see people run into. Thanks everybody for coming. Hopefully you guys took a little bit away. And yeah, we'll see all of you guys at the networking event later, and really appreciate your time and hopefully bump into you guys later this week.